Good afternoon, everyone. The title of the session is From Periphery to the Center. Basic Income Initiatives from Provinces. In my view, that's a very very important thing for any scheme or any measure to work. It differs from center to periphery. I see a lot of representatives, probably many are from center. I mean, if you really look, take center periphery in either Wallerstein sense or Frank, who has coined word that in Europe, basic income is going to be different and in periphery is going to be different. Because center is different and periphery is different. Within periphery, there are centers and peripheries. There are different states with different political economy. And there is a political economy behind a change which will allow and which does not allow. Both, it allows as well as constraints and implementation of any kind of things. So to some extent, I hope this conference will be able to bring that political economy aspect also into discussion. And I invite G.V. Ramajanelu first to make his presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share some of our experiences. I work with farmers, small and marginal farmers across the country, particularly those who are in distress, so trying to find systemic solutions which can actually solve the problems which farmers are facing. So we work in production areas. We also work on trying to address markets. We also try and look at how public policies impact farmers and then how policies can change. So for the last 10 years, we are trying to look at how income securities can be brought in to farmers, particularly because in India, we are about 54% of people depend on agriculture, and the entire investment made in agriculture is driving agriculture in a particular way, and then the whole crisis is seen. And to get out of the crisis, whatever measures government is trying to make is creating bigger crisis. So we try to look at how that can be addressed. So from there, we started working on a policy draft on farmers' income security, how farmers' income can be secured. So that was the broad framework which we were trying to look at. In that, direct income support is one of the key measure which we were trying to look at. And so, like Sharath was mentioning about right to Bandhu, the Telangana government began, and Andhra Pradesh government began similar kind of thing. So we try to understand how it is working at the field level also. So I'll share some of the experiences and put both of them in the right context. All of you know, in India, the farmers' income today, we look at based on the estimations by the Doubling Farmers Income Committee. This is a committee appointed by Government of India to look into doubling the farmers' income. It estimated it at around 8,559 per month at 2015-16 prices. The plan of the Government of India was that it will be doubling by 2022. So if you go by any measure, it should have been growing around 10.5% every year. But if you actually see the reality, it has grown only by about 3%, not more than that. So increasing the income by doing more of the same what government is trying to do till now and doing the same thing will not work. So it needs to find new ways of supporting. So if you look at even the data on income also is not very consistent. So if you look at the data from the NABARD's All India Rural Finance Inclusion Survey, it talks about 8,930. And there are a number of other measures where it shows differently. So there's no right data which is available even to make income estimations. And within the country, between the states, there is a lot of variation. So Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, if you look at, it's somewhere hovers around 8,600 to 7,000 to 8,000. So around that is what the income is around. So the whole crisis of agriculture, what we see, is because of the wrong models of agriculture where the input cost is increasing significantly and the prices are not increasing. And there is also significant amount of water, energy, and agrochemical use, which is also causing destruction to the natural resources. And there is also institutional failures. So the technological development in terms of addressing these issues is not there. Research, extension, markets, banks, insurance, the last mile delivery of support services. There's a significant failure in the last 60 years which has led to this crisis. And access to productive resources at the farmers level is not there again. So land, water, finances, not much access is created. And low public investment. In the total public investment, if you take out the investments made on chemical fertilizers, it's hardly about 2%, 3% annual budget which is spent at the central level, and state level also it's not more than that. It's about 3 to 5%. That's where the investments are. And a crisis which is caused by so many reasons, government tries to address by throwing out some freebies or some schemes which which are called by many names. So one of it I'll try and then explain what is happening in Andhra, Telangana. So direct income support measures. If you look at across the country, at the national level as well as at the state level, several measures have begun. And in Telangana, it began as Raitu Bandhu. And Odisha, it has begun as Kalia. West Bengal, it has begun as Krishi Krishak Bandhu. Andhra Pradesh, it started as Annadata Sukhi Bhava. And now it is called as YSR Raitu Bharosa. And at the central level, it is called PM Kisan, Pradhan Mantri Kisi Samman Yojana. All these initiatives are not universal. It is not universal. So they are not universal. Doesn't fit into the definition or purpose of universal basic income. It doesn't. They are very targeted. They're very targeted. And unfortunately, they're wrongly targeted. So there is no measure of doing this. And similarly, if you look at between them, say Andhra Pradesh government said they'll pay 10,000 rupees per acre. And then they said, oh, 10,000 per acre is not feasible, so we'll pay 10,000 rupees per family. Even before implementation. Then they said, we will actually pay only 4,000 rupees, 6,000 rupees will come from the center. And by that time, government lost election. So the whole myth that Raitu Bandhu brought TRS back to election in the winning is also wrong. If TRS won because of direct income support, probably TDP also would have won in Andhra Pradesh. They also made the same promise. It is not true. There are various other political reasons which are responsible for that. Wrongly perceived that this is what has done, many other states are getting into it. Next. So let's look at what is actually this Raitu Bandhu about. This Raitu Bandhu talks about paying around 4,000 rupees per acre. So 8,000 rupees in a year is what government of Telangana promised in 2018. And in the last elections, they promised it to increase it to 10,000 rupees. So 5,000 rupees per season in 2 installments. So that's the first promise. Second one, only to landowners. Very clearly, it's only to landowners. Obviously, that's what is the conditionality all about. There's no cap on maximum land holding, hence no cap on the amount paid. So even if you have 100 acres, you can get. If you have 0.2 acres, then you'll only get 0.2% of the 5,000 rupees. So that's how the whole money was calculated. So it is not based on the need or requirement of the people, but it is based on the land holding. So in reality, it is actually an incentive for owning land. It is an incentive for owning land because even NRIs were given. Even the people who left farming were given. But actually, the people who are actually cultivating were not given. So that is something which we need to understand. So the data available shows that of the 12,000 crores of 2018, government was allocated that, but it's around, so it's near about that money was given. But interestingly, if you look at the total number of farmers who benefited, significant amount of farmers are left out. Significant amount of farmers were left out. Who are they? If you look at next. So this is some attempt which is made to put the same money for each class of farmers, and then this is done by some of our friends who are attending a workshop on farmers' income security. So you can look at how the Raitu Bandhu
actually has increased the incomes of certain classes of people. So if you have more land, the percentage of increase on your income increases. So today, we created all incentives for owning up land. So if you own a land, you have a tax exemption, income tax exemption for you. You can get a interest-free credit. You can get Raitu Bandhu. You can get, if there is a crop failure, you get compensation. If you are cultivating, you are not getting any benefit out of it. So more and more people holding land and not doing farming has become a reality. Near about 20 to 25% tenancy is there in Telangana, and near about 30% tenancy is there in Andhra Pradesh. So that's the situation. So how do we address that is an important issue. So let's look at actually the specific problems. It should have been focused only on cultivators. If it is an investment support, as actually the GO says, as actually the scheme says, it should have been given only to the cultivators. Why only to the landowners? Because there's a big difference between them. And government promised to do a comprehensive land survey. It has not done. It has not done. Because the land survey which was done significantly almost 30, 40 years back is what the survey done. Later on, nothing was done. And in fact, on the Pahani, the land records, there is a column which annually government officer is supposed to fill saying who is actually cultivating the land. They now removed that column. They removed that column. So now government says it is the discretion of the landowner to transfer this money to the cultivator. Similarly, the Podu, the shifting cultivation and the farmers, the Forest Rights Act, lands came into the people on the forest fringe areas, and then there is a shifting cultivation. Data is there, but they are not paid. They are not brought into that. Government of Telangana, immediately after it came to power, it done an extensive survey of every household. It is called Samagra Kutumba Survey. And that data is not in public domain. And that data actually says who is cultivating, who is staying where, kind of thing. But that information was not used. And payments to NRIs. This is a significant issue. Around 20% of the money, total money, went into NRIs. That's what many reports and records said. And why NRIs? Even there was a cabinet subcommittee met and discussed about it, how to pay to them. If it is an incentive to a livelihood support, if it is about a basic income, it should not be like that. Even if it is a support for cultivation, it should be to the cultivators. And how it should be. If you look at actually, if it is about investment or if it is about income support, not every farmer is taking the same risk. So dryland agriculture versus irrigated areas. In irrigated areas, you are putting a lot of investment. But in the dryland areas, you are not putting any investment. So how do you actually have a better support for dryland areas is what government should have thought about, even if it is an investment. And interestingly, this also created a problem because since landowners gets the money, they're trying to hold it, and then they're not even passing on any benefits to the farmers. So even to sign saying you're a tenant farmer, they're not agreeing on that. That is also a serious problem. This Annadata Sukhibhava started in Andhra Pradesh 2019. It went on only for one season. Only for one season. And a very quick, in a haste, AP government in 2019 February decided they will announce a scheme. For every farmer, they will pay 10,000 rupees. And they said, we'll pay only 2,000 for now. Next will be paid after the election. And they paid the 2,000 rupees. And then they said, tenant farmers we are unable to identify. We'll pay to tenant farmers after 2019. And farmers having more than 5 acres will be given 10,000 rupees directly from the state government. For the farmers who are having less than 5 acres, they will use the 6,000 rupees which comes from the center. So state will only pay 4,000 rupees. And they sanctioned some money, and then in 2019 it has been done. And new government has taken away this scheme. New government came up with a new scheme. Here is the catch. If all these are going to be schemes, and schemes of political parties, not a regular measures of the government, which doesn't change with the changing governments, it would be extremely difficult. Rules change, amounts change, and there is no basis on which these amounts are fixed. There is no basis on which who is paid, how it is paid, kind of thing. So they're becoming more of a freebies kind of thing. Next. Now, if you look at 2019, the new government came up. New government said they will pay, now they will pay 12,500 rupees. And so it comes to 50,000 rupees over a period of 5 years. So during all the 4 years, they want to pay 50,000 rupees. And they say, we'll give 2,500, we'll put in 2,500 crores to pay to the tenant farmers also. But the catch here is, you have to get certificate from the landowner saying you are a tenant farmer. So obviously, none is going to get any of these supports from them. Next. So what are the key issues? Key issues are, is this an income support or is this an investment support? Both are very different. Because if it is an investment support to reduce the cost of cultivation, it should work in a different way. If it is an income support, then it should work in a very different way. But both should be targeted to the cultivators. And without targeting cultivators, if you are only giving to the landowners, it doesn't work. It doesn't serve the purpose. Similarly, quantum of support. What is the basis on which 6,000 rupees is decided on the PM Kisan, or 10,000 rupees is decided by Raitu Bandhu, or 10,000 rupees is decided by Kalia, or 12,500 rupees is decided by Andhra Pradesh government? No measure. It is not linked to any measure. And it is even not linked to the inflation or any other thing. So it should, if you are announcing any scheme like this, it should be linked to the all other variables which government takes to fix the incomes of the employees. It cannot be like will and wish of a political party. Now if you look at, say next 5 years it is going to be 6,000 rupees PM Kisan. Or suddenly if Prime Minister feels it has to be increased to 10,000 rupees, they will increase. Or if they want to reduce, they will reduce. So that kind of uncertainty doesn't work. If you are talking about income, it should be secured. So how do we do that is an important issue. Targeted community is again very, very critical. It should be for cultivators. All measures should be ensured towards that. And it's actually a party scheme. It is not a government scheme. Literally, it is a party scheme. And as a result of all this, farmers are finding it very difficult to access land. In Andhra Pradesh today, if you look at the tenancy cost has increased significantly. It has increased significantly, and they are saying, so even if I don't give land to cultivate, even if I don't give you for tenancy, I'll get my money. Even Telangana, it's the same. Per acre they are giving, so I won't give it for tenancy, and they're bargaining for a higher tenancy cost. So I think that's a serious issue which one need to look into. So the kind of fallouts which it is creating. Instead of that one, what best can be done? If you look at, we feel income security measures comes from actually creating a livelihood security. So to create livelihood security, particularly in agriculture, there should be a policy balancing act between raising cost of cultivations, decreasing prices, the cost of living, and the supports and subsidies given by the government. Today, decisions on these four are taken independent of each other. A policy to import, which will have a significant impact on reducing prices, is taken independent of what is happening to the farmers. Similarly, a decontrol which significantly increases the fertilizer prices is taken without looking into what is going to happen to the input cost. So any decision taken should be a balancing act between the four, and it should be the responsibility of the government to discuss and then take a decision as a balancing act between that. They should actually have a framework where these cross impacts are measured. Without doing that, it's going to be very difficult. Second, the entire support systems which are available today, the subsidies, have to change. They are all product-based or land-based. So we need to make a significant shift on that. So if somebody uses more power, there is a more power subsidy which is available. If somebody reduces energy use, what is the incentive they have? If somebody reduces water use, what is the incentive they have? If I don't buy chemical fertilizers, if I make my own organic fertilizers and use, what is the incentive I have? So how that shifts can happen is something which is very important. So the subsidy schemes have to change. The way they are supported have to change. They need to become more targeted. Then the the entire income security comes in. So universal basic income, if we are talking about, this is over and above all these things. It is over and above all these things. Anything which is given among them, you cannot consider as a universal basic income. Say fertilizer subsidy directly transferred to farmer is not a direct income, is not a universal basic income. Likewise, whatever is paid as direct income support is actually to reduce their input costs. So it is not a universal basic income. Thank you.
I'm happy Ramanjanailu actually has touched upon some things which I was also the things which are bothering me. That my point is also that even though there could be technical solutions to problems, techno-managerial solutions to problems for distributional questions, there is also a certain political economy that is going to decide. And without wasting, I'll give you time. I'll give example that NGNREGA, the way the money is siphoned off by using contractors and the machines which are completely against the law. And because that's what the political economy forces to control the regime, and that's what they decide. And in states where the landlords who are not no longer are actually doing agriculture in southern states moved out of agriculture, and therefore there is a space created for many of the welfare schemes to be implemented better. So there is going to be certain political economy aspect which is going to decide. And similarly, even if there's a big scheme like Raitu Bandhu, it's always at the risk of being hijacked and for redistribution. That's another aspect which we should really take into account while making a basic income as a successful policy. I now invite Rahul Basu.
Thank you all for being here. Post-lunch session, I can see a few nodding off, but still, you're here, and that's very good. I'd like to start by thanking Sarath and the INBI team, as well as Bien and especially Guy Standing, who've been strong supporters for what we are doing out in Goa and have given us faith. I'll talk a little bit more about it in the session in a couple of days. But I thought, let me just quickly talk about what we're trying to do in Goa and give it a little bit of a context of how we're trying to implement it politically. We'll talk also about the concept again in a couple of days. So this really, I come from Goa Foundation. I'm a volunteer there. And Goa Foundation is an environmental non-profit working since 1986. Mining iron ore mining is our single biggest environmental problem, and Goa Foundation has been fighting this since 1992. I've joined with Goa Foundation in about 2011, and I've come at this whole problem of mining really from a corruption standpoint and the way it's distorting the entire politics, governance, democracy in the state of Goa. And as we'll discuss, as you'll see, these kinds of problems are there across the country. So what is the political problem in mining in Goa? Just at a very rough level, mining started in the 1950s when the Portuguese were still in control. There were 800 mining leases in a really small territory, and these were perpetual leases. So the guys who got these mining leases over a period of time felt that they actually owned the mineral, which they don't. Now, the terms of the lease were such, and we'll see this a little bit later, that a lot of money was being thrown out and the mining companies became very rich. And from even as early as 1961, when Goa was liberated, the mining companies were basically, or the miners were basically in control of the entire political system because they were the ones with the money. So they decided, our first chief minister, in fact, was a miner. He was a mine owner. Also, interestingly, for the Indians here, he was probably the first OBC chief minister in the country and actually did a lot of progressive things like land reforms, primary education, primary health care. But he was also a mine owner. And this whole system of mining controlling the politics of Goa has been on for the last 60 years. Now, iron ore mining has gone through ups and downs like most commodities. There are times it's superbly profitable, and there are times when you just don't make any money because there's no demand. So what happens when the prices come down in iron ore mining is that the miners basically try to figure out how can we break the rules so that we can reduce our cost and still break even and being able to do something. So a simple example is that most of the trucks in Goa are allowed to transport 10 tons. So when prices are low, you can't make money. What they do is they add a little sideboard illegally to it and put 12 tons on it. So, the cost of transportation goes down. The politicians are happy to allow it because, otherwise if mining stops, then there's an employment problem and there's a whole bunch of other political consequences they don't like. So they let it take place. Soon enough, prices go back up, but the sideboards remain because now that's become the accepted practice. There's an accepted way of bribing the politicians, the policemen who are supposed to check this, and the whole system is now in this corruption mode. Then what happened over time was that because of the way mining was being done, because these guys felt they were in charge of the whole economy, is that they started breaking all the laws, including the environment laws, and creating a lot of human rights damage. And the people in the mining area started protesting. So what did the miners do? What any of us would do actually in the same position. They went to the leaders, the local leaders in those mining areas and said, why don't you buy a truck? And we can run a truck at 3 rupees a ton kilometer. We'll give you 11 rupees a ton kilometer. Basically, 8 is the implicit bribe. So they co-opted all the local leaders, or many of the local leaders, into owning trucks and becoming part of the system. So you had now, and the entire anti-mining, sort of the pro-environment, pro-human rights movement got split. Now let's look at, so in Goa, mining, while it's a small state, mining dependent, people who own trucks, people who have jobs, are maybe 10% of the population. The people who don't want mining because the truck is in their face, or they're bleeding heart environmentalists, are probably another 10%. Most of the people are living in the cities or along the beaches and saying, what's the problem with mining? It's happening. It's not so good, but it's creating a lot of jobs, and it's getting foreign exchange for the country, and it's getting government revenue. So, let's do mining, and, maybe we have to try and figure out how to improve things. So this is where Goa Foundation in 2012 got into some litigation at the Supreme Court, where there was a commission which found lots of illegalities, and we asked the Supreme Court to do a permanent ban on mining. The Goa government in turn came back and said, no, please don't do that. 20% of the population is dependent on mining, and we'll have a law and order problem, and the Supreme Court will be to blame. Supreme Court did not want to be blamed. So they picked up an issue of something called intergenerational equity and said that, we've said this is part of our fundamental rights, and we want to implement intergenerational equity, and how do we do that? Now, I'm not going to go into intergenerational equity. If you were here yesterday, you could have heard the talk at Nalsar. But we came up as a result of that with a very crisp, concise idea. And I'll take you through how we're trying to communicate this in India and in Goa. And this will be the rest of, this is where the basic income component comes. So we have 5 principles for mining, for what we're calling fair mining. The first principle is the state owns natural resources, including minerals, as a trustee on behalf of the people and especially future generations. The state owns minerals as a trustee for the people and future generations. This is constitutional in India and actually most parts of the world. The second principle, as we have inherited the minerals, nobody out here has created minerals, as we have inherited the minerals, our obligation is to make sure our children inherit either the minerals all its full value. Okay, this is intergenerational equity actually. This is also constitutional in India. To take a quick example now of intergenerational equity in practice, and this I'm going to use an Indian example, but so suppose you inherit, let's say, a gold bangle. In India, everybody understands that if you've inherited the gold bangle, you don't have a right over it. You can wear the gold bangle and feel that you're looking good, but you must make sure that your next generation, whether it's your daughter, your daughter-in-law, if you don't have children, then your nephews and nieces inherit the gold bangle. You do not have a right to break it up and finish it off. So now you have this gold bangle. You have two choices. One is you can, put it into the ground or keep it in a safe deposit locker in the bank. It gives you no income, but it's a cost. So you might decide that, let me sell the gold bangle and buy a small piece of land. You've seen the kinds of pieces of land. As long as I keep the land properly, I get an income, my child inherits the land, and they can get the income, and it can go down through generations. So this is the broad concept of intergenerational equity that we're promoting. So principle 3 is this. If we decide to sell our minerals, we must ensure zero loss mining. Every single bit of value we must get. And in this case, the state of Goa, as the legal owner under a constitution, has to get the full value of the minerals other than extraction costs and a profit for the extractor. Principle 4 is, whatever we receive from the sale of our minerals, we must save for our future generations. Now, we can't buy that much land because the minerals are very valuable. There isn't enough land to buy. So we basically are suggesting what many countries do, Norway being the great example, create a big mutual fund or an endowment fund for the people. And again, as long as you keep the real value of that fund intact, so you keep reinvesting up to inflation, you protect it against theft, you've done your duty by future generations. Instead of getting the mineral, they're going to get the fund. Principle 5, we own the minerals, we own the fund because the fund has been created from the minerals, so we own the income from the fund beyond inflation, the real income of the fund. So we are saying that simply distribute that equally to everybody in the state of Goa as owners. It's a right of ownership, it's a citizen's dividend, it's a universal basic income. These are our 5 principles of fair mining. Each one of these are, in our mind, constitutional in the country and most likely constitutional everywhere. And if you think about it, it hits on many of the sort of moral values we consider dear. Of course, it's fair from many aspects. Mining continues, the miner gets a reasonable profit, the truck owners and the mining dependent get employment, but the real value of the mineral goes to the people who own the minerals, which is us and the future generations, and we share the value. So it's fairness. It also, if you think about it a little bit deeper, it embodies justice, equality, liberty, fraternity, and many other things. But one important part is, it is within a generation equality and not equity. And I want to make this point, and there is a political reason to it that I'll come to a little bit later. Also, now why do we suggest this particular structure? It's an ownership structure, yes, but we are actually trying to solve a different problem. We're trying to solve the resource curse problem. So what is the aim of this? So the aim of the dividend, okay, how many of you, let me ask, show of hands, how many of you own minerals? Please raise your hand if you own minerals. I see one hand there, one hand there. Anybody on stage? There's somebody who's raising that. Okay, only 2 people own minerals. I also own 3, 4. Actually, most likely, every single person in this room owns minerals. Most likely. In India, offshore minerals are owned by the national government as a trustee on behalf of us. Everybody who's Indian owns minerals. In most geographies, including the US, In the US, it's a little exceptional, but in most countries, the state owns minerals on behalf of the people. So most of you are owners of minerals. Even in the US, the land ownership, the mineral ownership goes with the land. Offshore minerals, like in the Gulf of Mexico, belongs to the national federal government. So if you're from the US, you have a right in that mineral. Plus, about 30% of the land in the US belongs to either the federal government or the state governments. So almost everybody here owns minerals, but you don't even know it. Why? So the purpose of the dividend is to connect the person to the mineral, and it's not enough to create a feeling of ownership, but we have to do a lot of other things to inculcate that feeling of ownership. Now, if you have that feeling of ownership, what does the rest of the structure do? Zero loss mining is very powerful. And here's what we found when we analyzed what was happening in Goa. We took our single largest mining company and we did a thought experiment. We own the minerals, so we could ask them to be a contractor for us. Whatever they sold the mineral for, we could have sold the mineral for the same value. But they would have said that we need to be compensated for all our expenses. Plus, we need to earn a profit. They're in business fairly. So we we looked at all the expenses as per their annual audited financial statements. We looked at the capital they deployed in the iron ore mining business, and we gave them a 20% after-tax return on assets. Again, somebody who's familiar with India will know that's an exceptionally high rate of return. And we did that deliberately because if we put it at the correct level of 10 to 12%, the India said not 12%, 13%, your calculations are wrong. But if they argue with 20%, it's obvious that, it's obviously stupid. So, we found that for every 177 rupees of iron ore we exported, the cost of extraction was 170, the cost of extraction was 60, and this reasonable profit was 10. So the minerals were worth 100 rupees to the state of Goa. I've just normalized the values to get to 100. Now, how much, as the owner of these minerals, how much does the state of Goa get? Less than 5. So we are selling something worth 100 for 5 to the mining companies. The mining companies are, yay, bonanza. Let's extract everything and disappear before these guys figure out what's going on. Environment be damned, human rights be damned. We'll just buy out all the politicians and bureaucrats and disappear. So the zero loss and the citizens' dividend is supposed to make everybody in the state of Goa basically overseeing these mining guys and completely changing the incentive structure. Because instead of getting something worth 100 for 5, now they're getting for 100, and everybody's going to be sitting and watching them. Now let's look at the political incentive. Mr. Rai is going to speak after me, but a big incentive for extraction, one is of course the upfront corruption, but second is now that even that 5 rupees that comes can be spent by the politician. But what we've said is this is not your property. You have to get 100 and you have to put it into a future generations fund. Doesn't go to the budget, you don't get to spend it. And when there's income that goes directly to the people, that also you can't spend. Now, if you want to build a bridge or a statue for whoever you like, you raise a tax on us, you come to us, convince us to pay the tax, and if you like it, we'll pay the tax and you build the statue or you build the school, whatever else. But this mineral belongs to us and our future generations. If you want to extract the mineral, you do it on these terms and you are not going to benefit really. So even those incentives change dramatically. Can this be implemented is the other question. Now, with this strategy, we can go to that 80% living in the cities who don't care about mining and saying, we're not saying stop mining, we all have cars and phones. We're going to have mining, but we're going to do it in a way that benefits us, benefits our children, and is just fair overall. That's one. Secondly, from an economic standpoint, all we're saying is, we as the people own the mineral, so we own the fund, we own the dividend. So it just follows any kind of property rights. So if the elite says, no, 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 we don't want to do that, say, okay, fine, you don't agree with the property rights of the commons, then we don't agree with the property rights of yours. So no economist can really argue with this. And which kind of a politician will implement something like this? Well, somebody like Mr. Rai, possibly somebody who is a Bernie Sanders or even a Trump, somebody who wants to go down in history. And the communication is quite simple. You know, let's stop all this crony capitalism and do it in this manner, and everybody wins. And, you know, the fear on my side really in propagating something like this is that these kind of people might become dictators for life. So to conclude, what have we achieved? This is all good in theory. In our Supreme Court case, on grounds of intergenerational equity, the Supreme Court of India ruled that for Goa iron ore, a permanent fund has to be set up with a new levy on iron ore, as well as a cap on extraction. Today, that fund exists with $70 million. Extraction actually has stopped, so there's no money accumulating. But the principle has been established. The fund exists. It's a global judicial precedent. Any of you can go anywhere in the world and argue this. The second thing we have done is we have used all of this. Now, you've heard about Chapter 9 in the Economic Survey, but there's also a Chapter 13 in the Economic Survey, where Arvind Subramanian, who's done work on these ideas also in the past, has actually written about this idea in Chapter 13 and talked about this whole way of looking at it. But more importantly, earlier this year, the national government came out with the National Mineral Policy 2019, and one sentence is critical. It says this: natural resources, including minerals, so natural resources, the whole thing. Natural resources, including minerals, are a shared inheritance where the state is a trustee on behalf of the people to ensure that future generations receive the benefit of their inheritance. This is no longer Rahul Basu, Goa Foundation advocating this. This is the national government telling everybody in the country that natural resources are a shared inheritance where we have a responsibility to our future generations. So anybody in the country can now go to the government and say, we want this policy implemented. And anybody not in India can go to their governments and say, see, this is what the Indian government is doing. Let's do this. Our global platform is called The Future We Need. And Roberto, who's visited us in Goa, is wearing a T-shirt. And if you do visit us in Goa, you'll get a T-shirt. But please, we want campaigns all across the planet, because at a very deep level, if we consume our inheritance, at some point there will be no inheritance for our children and civilization will blow up. So the intergenerational equity is absolutely critical, and we need these kinds of advocacy all over the world. And at the end of the day, you also get a basic income. So there's great benefits for everybody. But if you think about it, the advocacy gets in human rights, gets in anti-corruption, gets in the environment movement, gets in, just the whole broad spectrum of civil society will combine to support such a thing. It's not just the basic, it's almost any civil society movement will want to support this. It should be doable. We strongly believe it can be done, and we strongly believe it can be done all over the world. So please join us in making real the future we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Fascinating example of Goa state is a state with extremely conscious people. It has got a very vibrant environment movement, and it's going to be a test case whether how far, what are the constitutionally defined and promised nature of functioning of the state, and in practice what it would be, and how far civil society would be actually be able to neutralize this. It will be an extremely fantastic case of how much of primitive accumulation which the state in India had been without any bounds had been aiding the private primitive accumulation. And Goa, perhaps I wish Goa Foundation success in the future, and I hope they succeed. And but all across, mining always gives a very good example of how primitive accumulation is allowed, and industry entire the past of the capitalism is based on the primitive accumulation, which, as Marx said, it may not be simply a prehistory, but it is a continued history, and at some place or the other. And I once again congratulate Rahul for an extremely good presentation. I invite now Kishore Samal.
I was given the responsibility of speaking on Kaliya Yojana of Odisha. That Sharad Dabla has requested me that this Kaliya is a cash transfer scheme by the government of Odisha, but this is a political step mixed with the religious feeling of Odia peoples. Before speaking, I am saying what is the meaning of Kaliya? K-A-L-I-A. This is a short form. In K, it is Krushak. Assistant, for A, assistance. For L, for livelihood. And I, for income. And A, for augmentation. All last words, 4 to 5 words are English. But the first word is in Odia. Krushak assistant for non-Indian English. Krushak means farmers. Krushak assistant for livelihood and income assessment. And Kaliya, Krushak, so that the short form will be Kaliya, and Kaliya is said to Krishna or Jagannath, which is the most important deity of Odiyas. But Krishna is a really diplomat and romantic person, but his elder brother Baliya or Balaram is a farmer or takes charge of agriculture. Really the name should have been Baliya if religion would have been introduced. But since Jagannath is popular, the government deliberately, knowing it, named it as Kaliya so that the people will be attracted to the schemes. And this scheme, just before the state assembly election, it was introduced. And this Rayatya Bandhu scheme of Telangana has influenced the government of Odisha. Due to the Rayatya Bandhu scheme, there was massive victory of this KRS political parties, and to knowing this, government of Odisha introduced this scheme to transfer the cash to the farmers. Just I am saying some features. 5,000 per season, and for 5 seasons it was 25,000 rupees to the small and marginal farmers. And similarly, another thing was the life insurance supports to the farmers or cultivators, and interest-free crop loan to the tune of 50,000 rupees at 0% interest rates. And also the students or the boys, the children of these cultivators were given educational scholarships. Here I want to say who will get these benefits. The cash transfer scheme is not only for the land owning cultivators. I am in an awkward situation. I am going to support my government, but I never support to any BJD government or any Odisha governments. So it will also, this assistance will go to landless agricultural household besides the small and marginal farmers, so those who are land owning farmers. It will also go to the vulnerable agricultural households. They were earlier cultivators, but due to disease or some handicapness, they are unable to do. It will also go to the landless agricultural laborers. It will go to the sharecroppers and actual cultivators. So this Kaliya scheme, which is a cash transfer scheme to the cultivators of Odisha, will not only go to the land-owning farmers, but to other cultivators, so those who are landless, or sharecroppers or the riots, which is not in Telangana. Or in this way, Rayata Bandhu scheme of Telangana only perhaps only gives assistance to the land-owning cultivators. But in case of PM Kisan also, it also gives assistance to the land-owning cultivators. But in case of Odisha, we can say the Kalia is better than PM Kisan and also Rayata Bandhu of Telangana, because it not only gives to the land-owning cultivators, but to the landless cultivators, to the vulnerable agricultural household, and landless agricultural laborers, and sharecroppers and cultivators. So in this way, the Kalia scheme of Odisha government, which is a basic income, or you can say cash transfer scheme, is better than the Rayata Bandhu of Telangana, which is first of its kind in India by any state governments. Also, it is better than PM Kisan because it also gives cash transfers. It also transfers cash to the land-owning cultivators. Then, coming to this, I will speak something about what is the limitations of a Kalia scheme, or the real term is Krushak Assistant for Livelihood and Income Augmentations. I said that it is better than other schemes like Tamil Nadu or PM Kisan of the central government of India, but how one can know that who is the sharecroppers. In Odisha, around 70% of the cultivators are sharecroppers. They are not landowners. But there is no land documents or any records of sharecroppers, except perhaps in West Bengal and Kerala, no government has the record of the sharecroppers. A purchase given in West Bengal to say that you are the sharecroppers, and he can show this receipt and take the loan from the banks. But in Odisha, there is no such registrations of the sharecroppers by the government of Odisha. So in that way, though it is seems to be better, but it is very difficult to know who are the sharecroppers. Only 70% of the land are under sharecroppings. Next is, Kalia is better, as the Chief Minister of Odisha said, it is better than loan waiver schemes. Because when there is loan waiver schemes, then most of the intelligent farmers, they take the loan from the bank and they never repay, thinking that the election is coming and they will not have to repay the loan, and there will be loan waiver schemes. So in that sense, this Kalia scheme is far better than the loan waiver schemes. And another, there was scheme for 5,000 for one crop and 10,000 for two crops, and in 1 year, two crops in 1 year. But it is also very difficult to know whether a land has one crop or two crops, and most of the officers are dishonest and inefficient. They will not be able to say whether he is the cultivator who has two crops a year on his lands. And many farmers even have no document that they are the owner of their own land. The documents are not perfect. Some have no documents at all, because most of them illiterate. This is another limitations of the Kalia schemes. And one survey, quick survey done by Navakrishnan Chaudhary Center for Development Studies, ICSR Institute, they have calculated that a small farmer will get around 16% of the cost of cultivations. The amount, that means 10,000 per year, will only suffice to cover the 60% of the cost of cultivation. And for marginal farmers, it will cover the half of the cost of the cultivations. So this is not sufficient for the farmers to improve his agriculture. Another merit to some extent that its earnings of the farmers will increase due to the cash transfer. He may drinking has increased. The sale of wine in Odisha has increased after the introduction of Kalias. Those who are young farmers, they take the loan and drink and spend all this money. So even if this Kalia scheme, this transfer of case under Kalia scheme to the cultivators of Odisha will increase their earning and address the liquidity problem to some extent. So what are the practical problems? These are the limitations, theoretical limitation I said about the Kalia scheme. What is happening in Odisha at present? The government of Odisha has indirectly admitted that the Kalia scheme is a failure, because he has asked the officers at the panchayat level and the block level to verify the list of the beneficiaries. Most are ineligible, and most are ineligible to get this benefit, but has got it. So in this sense, ineligible beneficiaries will be identified and recognized by the government of Odisha officials to return back their money which they have taken. So this is the indirect admission of the government of Odisha that they have given this money or transferred the money to the account of the some ineligible farmers or cultivators. Then second, this is the first practical problems. And first, they have transferred the cash to the bank account of the cultivators. And around 32 lakh farmers, and most of them, around 90% of them were their party supporters. Just before the election, they transferred immediately in a hurried manner. So there was a mistake in identifying. But we are saying mistake in identifying, but they know very well that these are our supporters. And so first, they have transferred this case under a Kalia scheme to their bank accounts. Another problem, this is not major problem, the forms were available free of cost to the farmers to apply. But some of their ruling party supporters, they took away all the forms from the office and they sold in the black market at 100 rupees per farm. These are the practical difficulty on implementing the Kalia scheme. I am not speaking against Kalia scheme. Another difficulty was that some ineligible cultivators have received who are ineligible. I am a government servant. I am a landowner. The money has gone to the government, my bank accounts. Lakhs and lakhs like this. And so in one family, 4 to 5 persons have got this money on under Kalia schemes. So these are the ineligible cultivators, but they have received money under Kalia scheme. And some are eligible, those who are sharecroppers, those who are illiterate, landowner, but have no land records. They are eligible to get the cash benefit under the Kalia scheme, but they have not yet received the schemes. But on the other hand, those who are ineligible, by manipulation, they have received their money, or by mistake of the government officers or corrupt practices of the government officers, they have received these monies. Another thing, those who are saying now, they are creating the doubt that the cash transfer schemes, Kalia scheme, the government has given a huge amount of money to the cultivator, and said that the agriculture budget has increased. But when you are deducting this amount which is earmarked for the Kalia scheme, agricultural budget has decreased. That too, agriculture budget for agriculture or for irrigation has totally, highly decreased to a large extent. Another, again I am repeating, I am not speaking against basic income or cash transfer scheme. Cash transfer schemes are good, but necessarily cash transfer schemes to farmers are not good. It is not going to the real cultivators. My suggestion to improve the economic condition of the farmer, I am not talking against all types of cash, against only the cash transfer scheme for the farmers. For improving the agricultural productivity and improving the socio-economic condition of the farmer, this first infrastructure investment, taking the background of Odisha, in irrigation, cold storage, crop diversification, credit delivery. Those who are saying that let them give me at a 0% rate of interest, but the farmers which we have surveyed, they said we want credit, but not necessarily at a concessional rate. We want adequate amount of credit and at a proper time, at sowing time and harvesting time, not necessarily at a concessional rate of interest. So advancing credit at a 0% rate of interest is not helpful for the agricultural productivity or for increasing the economic conditions of the farmers. And education and health facilities, local level institutions should be powerful to increase this agricultural development, and organization of rural poor to see that the officers are honestly implementing this scheme. Without the organizations of the rural poor, including landless agriculturalists and the agricultural laborer, no scheme for the improvement of the socio-economic conditions of the rural poor will be perfect if there is no organizations of the poor like landless agricultural laborers and landless cultivators. Thanking you very much for giving me.
Thank you. Once again, there's one more case of how the cash transfers is siphoned off by a configuration of forces which control the state, and very much with the collusion. State is in collusion, and in India there is a very good mix of class and caste. And in fact, it is the parties in power often represent one of the dominant castes, and there is always a rivalry between the two opposing parties. Also are backed by the rival and alternative dominant peasant caste, and each government tries to make sure that it also reaches disproportionately more to the dominant caste and the class. And this is how actually the state is captured in India, and both examples, Ramanjanailu and Mr. Kishore in Orissa, they presented the cases where the cash transfers are captured. And I hope we'll have a lot of discussion on this. And now, finally, I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Premdas Rai, who can show that how in Sikkim it could be slightly a different situation where basic income transfer could be more possible, and what makes it possible. Let's start.
Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just today dwell on the subject matter, which is basic income, and maybe some of the examples from the provinces. And I think the implicit thought there is that a lot of the basic income, maybe the traction may come from the states, and the federal government may somehow co-opt it. Now, in the session, which was the panel session, which happened before this, there was a very interesting unpacking of the whole issues around basic income, whether it is farmer cooperatives or farmer associations, versus maybe basic income replacing or subsuming some of the other social benefits that accrue to citizens here. And this unpacking has led us to further debate at the disaggregated level, some of the issues that may come up in the future as we move on this particular trajectory. But what is interesting is also the three presentations before this captured the essence of the political economy, captured the essence of what you're wanting to do, but has to be politically driven for a political agenda. And so are we really saying, all right, we have a farmer agrarian distress, so we need to address that. And if we need to address that, then why don't we do something which will not only address that, but also garner the votes? And it's done at a time just before the elections, and even the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, had to actually come up with this huge scheme, which is called the PM Kisan. Now, how the PM Kisan is working, there's nobody, no representative here to tell us that. But I'm sure it's not, it was very well advertised. The BJP machine went, the publicity machine went overdrive, and it was there out there on whether it's Twitter or whether it's on Facebook or whether it's in hoardings or whatever. It was just out there. I'm not quite sure whether the schemes at the state level were as well advertised. But let me just also go back to one more very important issue. And this important issue is that, after 2014, one of the most, I think, systemic disruptions that happened in our governance was the doing away of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission, the erstwhile Planning Commission, had the power to plan every state's annual plan. And this Planning Commission had not only the, but they were also the repository of all data. And today, it was substituted by what is now known as the Niti Aayog. And the Planning Commission and the 5-year plans were stopped. So the 12th 5-year plan ended sometime, I think, in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And thereafter, there is no plan. So states after states do their own planning. The devolution of money is done through what is known as the Finance Commission, and the 14th Finance Commission upped the amount, which was lifted from, I think, direct devolution was from, I think, 32% to 42%, and with a little bit of more funds for the panchayats and others. So one would imagine something like 55% of the tax collections were devolved to the states in a manner in which it was, the arithmetic for that has been, the model has been made by the 14th Finance Commission. But what it has led to is that every state has stopped planning. Unless, you see, if you had the Planning Commission, then the plans would be made using the planning resources of the states, but the planning resources of the states independently would not be able to plan. And therefore, a vacuum in planning has emerged. And this is very clear because if today, if you look at some of the ways in which states are moving forward, including my state, it's with the total absence of a long-term plan. Now, this is why, one of the reasons why in the state of Sikkim, we thought that using the generations, the well-being of generations bill, it was really to build another structure of planning which would then move Sikkim forward. But unfortunately, that did not happen. But why I'm bringing this out is that today, arguably, every state can plan and plan on its own. And if that is the opportunity, then just the planning muscle is required. And because there was a planning commission in the earlier days, what would happen is that these planning commission people would actually pick up one or two very important, well-run programs in the state. And I can give you an example, is the midday meal, which was alluded to by Dr. Shivakumar. The midday meal scheme, in which you get a hot meal for children in schools, is really a fantastic scheme. And this is a scheme which now is kind of, the Planning Commission was able to take it and scale it up in all the other states, and such like schemes. But as you move from one centrally sponsored scheme to another, the plethora of schemes was immense. So from education, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, to first known as the National Rural Health Mission, to now it is known as National Health Mission, and so on and so forth. There's a plethora of such schemes. And one of the first, I think, items on the agenda of the Niti Aayog was to actually cut down the number of schemes, scale them down. That 10% more of devolution was happening anyway. Why isn't it that some of the socially powerful schemes would be actually absorbed within that 10%? And so it is with a little bit of this kind of, the background I'm giving you is in order to dwell on the issue is that if there is a scheme like the universal basic income, and the one which we had thought for Sikkim, if it could have been done properly, we could have, could we imagine a situation in which it could have then been picked up by, say, the Niti Aayog, and then actually transposed to the rest of the country. What is the fault that, what is it that we need therefore to do is really the political economy question. And the political economy question is an important one because that's the reality. You cannot wish it away. The panel in the morning was able to argue, unpack, and say this is possible, this can be done, this is what we think is a good thing, this is something which needs a little more thinking through. Yes, all that is very well, but will it be a saleable commodity or a saleable product as far as the politicians go? And that's where I think it is important to engage with politicians and say a universal basic income scheme must have these sets of, these are the parameters around which you would actually judge a basic income scheme. That maybe these schemes in Telangana and in Odisha really didn't work is on account of the fact that the design was poor. The administration was poorer. And it really, that means we again have to go back to the drawing board and say why it really hasn't worked and how can we then make it work. But it is important to note that these kinds of experiments done in the states can only happen in states where there is more freedom. And that's why the whole concept of a regional entity or a regional party ruling the state becomes important, because a regional party because there are so many state subjects that they have the autonomy to be able to allow such innovations to happen in states. And I, for one, think that the one in which we had thought that what Mr. Rahul Basu has talked about in so far as how something as precious an inheritance as the minerals, you actually monetize that and then put it away and monetize it in the best possible manner, and you put it away for future generations as well as for generations that are already in existence. And that is the kind of thinking that had gone. Sarit and I worked on it for Sikkim, wherein the power generation that we do through hydro, all the money that comes from there, could we then not, why don't we, though it is renewable, why don't we start building a fund alongside? Also, fees that we could levy on tourists who come into Sikkim. And such like things which are there in terms of biodiversity and in high altitude areas, our glaciers and and water and so on and so forth. How can we start looking at the natural endowments which are for the commons, and see how we can actually monetize it, build corpuses, and then look for a nice way of ensuring that they not only work for us, there is intergenerational equity as well. So these are the thoughts, and I personally think, like I have said in the morning, that to get engaged in this kind of conversation, I think is very important. And it is important to see also that it is from the periphery, or it is from the states, that we will find some of these innovations actually happening. And the best part is that we have historical evidence. We have evidence where things are not happening. We have evidence where, like in MP, where things are happening. And what are the probably assumptions or the first kind of boundary conditions that will allow those things to happen. So I'm very sanguine about it. And as we move into the next phase of development of this idea, taking it to other people, taking it particularly to younger people, I think it is very, very important. And we have to use, as I was telling my friend Paul, we have to use a strategy which encompasses social media. It's very vitally important. So with those words, I hope I've been able to argue the case that it must be done in the states rather than at the center. Thank you very much.
India is at the cusp of actually a decline and economic decline, and it had a good 8-year high growth phase between 2003 to 2010, and a decline started in 2014, and now it matured, and we are into a recession, and the revenues of the state have severely been affected, and this is a period. Probably it's a good opportune moment for the state to rethink how to restructure itself in its, especially social welfare, which is not finding it easy to finance. Because if it has got good amount of corruption and leakage, it's an opportune moment for the state to rethink and redesign it in a way where the political equilibrium of the society is sustained, and at the same time, it benefits the class for which it is intended, but it requires some kind of a transcendence in the sense that the class forces which are holding the status quo have to be told that a new arrangement is going to be beneficial in totality, and therefore one should allow for this. Right now, all the existing schemes are captured by certain forces. Some are allowed to reach the poor to some extent. The rest are being cornered, siphoned off by the dominant. And these forces have to be either transformed, and they have to be shown alternative ways of accumulation so that they don't depend on these, like it happened in the southern states. For example, in Andhra Pradesh, Chief Minister Rajshekhar Reddy in 2004, when he implemented a series of welfare schemes, he told his cabinet that certain schemes is very serious and nobody should touch. None of the ministers should indulge in any corruption in some of them, like MJ NRJ. He warned them, and so he used social audit to nab those who have erred and punish them seriously. So, because he said that he told them that you can make money elsewhere. I'm making schemes, real estate booms, etc. You go buy land there and make money there. Don't eat into the money which are meant for the poor. So that's some kind of it's a transcendence where dominant forces in the urban and rural areas have found other areas of accumulation. So they allowed the welfare schemes to actually succeed. This did not happen in the north, where there is no such transcendence happened, nor there is a growth happened where the dominant forces have an alternative areas of accumulation. So still they pile on the whatever welfare, and they don't allow anything, they eat off them. So there is certain political economy process which is behind these, and we must, I'm sure if we can argue out that basic income is going to be a kind of a game changer, where for both, I don't know how much it will be, but for the state at least, which is facing a severe financial crisis, actually can find it much better in terms of delivery and efficiency, and also it will generate demand in the economy. And in a Keynesian sense, actually, it will actually revive the economy. Probably we have to explore these arguments also, so that we make a case for basic income at a policy level. Now I open the floor for discussion, and we'll have a discussion for about 25 minutes.
Yeah, my name is Tadashi Okanouchi from Japan. I'm teaching sociology in Japanese university. And from my perspective, basic income is a kind of a second decolonization movement in the world. So my question is, why you do not talk about the second decolonization? Because India has been a pioneer of decolonization movement in the world, I mean, in the human history. And it was led by Gandhi, and they got political independence. But after that, in the 1970s, the Indian government also struggled in the United Nations to have a new international economic order. So they wanted to implement the economic decolonization. But actually, since then, because of the transnational corporations, the growth of transnational corporations, the old kind of movement had collapsed. So, but now you are talking about the basic income in India. I think you should not be concentrated in the state level, regional level, or state, or the national level. I think the politicians and the people should talk about the history of colonization in India. And then, because the wealth of all human beings is now in the shape of transnational corporations' share capital. So we have the big target over there. And it is also the same for us in the Japanese and the United States, that OECD countries, the governments also want to collect the tax from those transnational corporations. But it is very, very difficult. Yeah. But so so my question is, why you Indian people do not talk about the colonization history, the decolonization movement? And I do hope that you will lead the global movement for decolonization, and that wealth, which was stolen by the colonialist history in human beings, and to end all these unhappiness for human beings. That is my question.
Thank you. Any other question? Yeah. Third row.
Peter Knight from the Sufficiency for Sustainability Network. You discussed the commons in terms of natural resources, but you didn't discuss intellectual resources. As Andrew Yang, a candidate in the United States, says, the oil of the 21st century is technology. And technology is built upon the commons of intellectual development of mankind, not on natural resources so much. So I wonder to what extent, and given the high-tech part of the Indian economy, which is, this city and Bangalore and others, you're not thinking about that element of the commons as a source of resources for universal basic income.
This is Min again from Oroville. I'm very concerned with one of the presentations that was made earlier. This might be personal, I don't know how many of you would share that concern with me, is when...
Can you take louder?
When the example of Goa was given as a success story, I feel that when you are extracting resources which will cause enormous environmental damage, and then you are putting it, the capital into the capitalist system, you are perpetuating it. I'm not sure this is addressing the intergenerational equity issue in a deeper way. I don't know how many of you share that, but I felt this maybe not be a great way to achieve that.
Hi, my name is Roberto. I teach philosophy in Portugal. Thanks a lot for all the talks. I have a question which is similar to the one just asked, but which goes in the opposite direction, because actually I sense a tension between, in fact, intergenerational equity and the need for that, and I see how important it is, and then the need to found the basic income for the actual generation. And so I wanted to, perhaps Raul and perhaps also Mr. Rai could explain to us how you can keep these two aims conciliatory. I mean, intergenerational equity and actual funding of a basic income for the people who need it now. Thank you.
Shall these four questions be answered? Then I'll again start. One question is perhaps Mr. Rahul Basu can answer, because two questions are on intergenerational equity and how.
Let me just first deal with, I'm not going to deal with the decolonization just now. Let me deal with the intellectual resources as a sort of intellectual property as a commons. This work has started from minerals, but it can be generalized into many directions. And I was 5 minutes over time, but I do have a second shot at it in a couple of days. But yeah, you know, there are many examples. There's a Sikkim example of hydropower. There's a separate, just another example in terms of natural resources, which people have not thought about, is all countries have spectrum fees for mobile telephony. And that is an absolutely renewable resource. There's no reason why spectrum fees cannot be distributed out as a basic income. But that's natural resources. In the longer process, any kind of commons, so you have intellectual commons, you would have things like land value tax, sort of the Georgist kind of an idea where the value of land is created by society. You can also go to government assets in many cases. When the government is privatizing assets, you can look at that and say that should also go into a permanent fund and go into this process. But it's really not a question of excluding anything. It's just a question of having enough time to explain. And the way we've done minerals, as far as we can see, nobody's done it or discussed it in this manner. There are analogies, but not quite. There's a separate question there on financialization of minerals, really. You know, when you take out minerals and convert it into cash, are you encouraging more and more extraction and conversion into cash, and then can you actually eat cash eventually? It is a definite concern. We come as an environmental NGO, not as a financial sort of basic income. Our political analysis is this: we cannot stop mining even in Goa despite the Western Ghats being there. We can ask for it. We actually did ask in the Supreme Court with very strong grounds. The point that keeps coming back is, like, even for this conference, a lot of us have flown, all of us have telephones, this has metal. There will be some amount of extraction. So if you remember how I explained intergenerational equity, we have two choices. One is we can keep the gold as is or the mineral as is, or we can convert it into financial capital. And if you note, our third principle always begins if we extract and sell our minerals. So if we do extract and sell our minerals, then this is the way to do it. But it is perfectly valid to leave the minerals in the ground. And the way to think about it is this: 30 generations of humanity before us have left the minerals in the ground, which is how we've got it. most likely, species live about 30 million years. We've hardly gone anywhere. So let's say another million generations after us. So maybe it is better to leave the minerals in the ground and maybe 10 generations after us, they come up with a better thing. But it's not something we can impose on the people. So we're saying that this is what you do if you do decide to extract it, but you have perfectly a good, valid reason not to extract it. And that also meets intergenerational equity.
I just thought that we have tremendous growth of IT sector, and income in IT sector enjoys tax-free status for the past 2 decades. And they also are supposed to pay 2% for corporate social responsibility, and they have not been spending. And when the government insisted, and it just threatened that it will send some of them to jail, and they have, you should see their reaction, and the stock prices have fallen, and they said that this is harassment, and this is, and all kinds of things, a promise which they are supposed to fulfill, and they're not fulfilling. So that's the status of the dominance of international capital in the form of IT sector, which is there, and multinational capital. I don't think it is easy for the state to harness, and it's a task.
The first question, I'll try and answer it, but really it's a question which, like I said, is maybe far higher up at a different level. Your question is, why can't India now, instead of talking about UBI and things like this, actually lead a global movement in which we decolonize the entire economic sector, and which really means that, you feel the power of corporations in the international economic order, and that needs a lot of attention and breaking down. And why can't India do it? Because perhaps maybe India has the Gandhian muscle to go ahead and do that. In a globalized world like the one in which we are living, and in the political and power arrangements that we are currently witnessing, I think this is a very, very tall order. This is something which I don't think will be on our sides in the near future. Perhaps when the issue of commons, or the issue which we are grappling with right now in terms of the financial flows and who is to own how much, where should it be going, once that is settled, perhaps then some sanity will prevail, and maybe we'll get a government that will think a little more equitably insofar as the global economic order is concerned. But I'm afraid that with all the kind of the right-wing agenda that is flowing throughout the world, including Japan, I think it is very hard to imagine a time in which the left of society will actually spring back. And there is ample chaos throughout the world. And in fact, I made a point that whether you look at what's happening in, say Hong Kong versus what's happening elsewhere in the world, including the shootings in the U.S., I think it all points to one thing, and that is that we are going through a tremendous amount of social disharmony. And I also made the point that perhaps we should look a little more deeply to see the layers that are actually being expressed through the same kind of disorder that is there. It is not maybe just wanting more democracy in Hong Kong, but it perhaps also leads one to believe that there are young people who may be so distressed about the situation, their own situation in terms of employment or the kind of work that they are doing, that it leads them to come to the streets and seize this as an opportunity for change. So this is where, this is where I think we are caught. We are caught up in a world which is spinning almost out of control. On the one hand, we have climate change and all its problems. If you see in India, every year it's getting from bad to worse. The temperatures are just rising. I mean, we've had our hottest temperatures yet, 52 degrees recorded in Rajasthan. And then we had a series of droughts in Western India, and now Western India is flooded. And it's just something quite mind-boggling. In the Himalayas, the glaciers are melting, and I'm actually working on that. The water issues for the next 50 years in my state. So, one can go on and on, but the situation is quite radical. However, coming back to universal basic income, and why do you think that universal basic income can become a buffer for future social problems that might emerge? And this is something which, that's why we say maybe the time has come. And maybe why is Mr. Narendra Modi also looking at a thing like PM Kisan? Or he's looking at ways and means of actually targeting the poor. Targeting the poor by way of direct benefit transfer. Using all the tech might that India has. I think that there is something to read into all of this. Now, finally, in the area of, I think, intergenerational equity, and I think the issue which I think the gentleman here talked about is about what about we're talking about the future, but then what about the funding of the present? I think we'd like to think about the future, but we are also thinking about the funding. But if you look, I'll give you an example. In Sikkim, we used to have a lot of forest cover. We had a lot of timber. Today, timber has to be brought from outside the state because the present generation has been left with no timber because the generations before us exhausted all of that. And so I think we don't have a measure as to say what we are consuming today, is it enough? Is it something that is equitable? But when we say intergenerational equity, I think it just stems from the fact that if you don't even think about it, I don't think we're going to even find the answers. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rajita. I'm a doctoral candidate at this university. Actually, I have a question for Rahul and then a comment. My question to Rahul is that the permanent funds, if you create a permanent fund, there's always this problem of over a period of time, would it able to sustain and give you a kind of stable return? And the kind of problem that Alaska is facing right now, when the revenue from the oil or any of those resources go down, then you have to make a choice between whether to invest money in public services or you should give people cash. So over a period of time when the coal runs out in Goa, wouldn't Goa face the same kind of problem? And how do you think we should deal with that, if you have any thoughts on that? Another is a comment, because in this presentation from the first speaker as well as Kishore Samal, we got a lot of like the problems of technological failures or siphoning off of money being transferred into wrong bank accounts, which is something that I'm working on in my thesis. And when we saw in the morning was much more, more positive, that it is good that we have that, but at the same time when we listen to them, we see that there's some sort of a gap somewhere. And maybe because by the admission of Ashok Bhushan, who is the chairperson of UIDAI, to Supreme Court, he said the failure rate of Aadhaar is 88%. Sorry, success rate is only 88%. So failure is 12%, which is huge. So I think that maybe as people who are working on UBI, we have to more critically think of the infrastructure that enables it, because if that is not robust, maybe we would not reach where we want to reach. Thank you so much.
My name is Ranjini. I would like the two farmers' presentation to explain how much of the benefits went to Dalit farmers, to women, because they don't, the women normally don't own the title of the land. So if you could add that bit of caste and gender and ethnicity, tribals normally don't have land, so I want to know that. The other quick comment is when we talk of basic income, one is seeing what is the welfare benefit, because 35% of India lives on multidimensional poverty. But at the same time, we have to look at equity and we have to look at rights, whether the people are using basic income to claim rights in unanticipated ways, to take part in protests, say, against MNCs, which take some of the agricultural land away, etc. So what is happening to that aspect of it in addition to environmental issues? So welfare, equity, rights and entitlement and sustainability. If we could look from all these lenses, we'll have a better picture. And as you said, the political economy matters, and I'm sure even with regard to basic income, it does matter.
Yeah, I'll come to you. Sorry.
I'm Peter Brake. I have modelled the Indian government finances and budget to answer what UBI can India afford and how. Farming has proved an interesting aspect of this work, and a comment is a UBI will remove the existing misallocation between farm owners and cultivators. My question is from the first presentation where we talked the average of the farming income is 8,000 rupees per month. I'm asking, is this 8,000 when it's doubled? I'm asking what the existing income now is, and is that gross or net of costs? And I would love to have access to that data. If there's somewhere that I can talk to you, it'd be most appreciated.
Thank you very much. This is Dr. Rajendra Deshpande. My question is to Honorable Shri Premadas Rai. He mentioned in his speech that instead of the center, states should initiate this process of minimum basic income. But I think you are more aware about the problems. The center or even the states, the problem of functioning of various corporations, gram panchayats, and the relationship between state and the center. Time and again, last 70 years, different committees have mentioned that there has to be a devolution of power, decentralization of functionaries, functions, finance, and everything, and that is not happening. So in absence of this, do you think the minimum basic income would be feasible? Because if I am an X party at the center and Y party is ruling at the state, there will be always the states which are opposing, they will always be feeling the crunch of the finances and supplies. So these problems will continue, and the problem of minimum basic income also will just remain a dream. Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm Robert van der Veen, a political theorist from the University of Amsterdam, and I would like to address a theoretical question to Rahul Basu on the Goa 5 principles. And it seems to me that the connection between the first 4 and the 5th principle is not that automatic as it seems in your presentation. So what I think is a little bit of a problem, theoretically at least, maybe empirically there is an answer, is that the revenue after husbanding the intergenerational problem in a correct way, the revenue that then remains for the present, for funding the present as it was discussed, is not automatically to be dispensed in the form of a basic income. I mean, it may be desirable, but I don't see any theoretical reason in your system, which is intergenerational equity, balancing the interests of the future against those living in the present. I don't see any reason why that particular way of dispensing the revenue, even though it is equitable and egalitarian in a sense, should be unconditional in the three senses that we are talking about: individual, obligation-free, and no means testing, universal. So maybe you could explain something that tightens this connection. In that case, I would be far more convinced about your story, which I am very sympathetic to as from the outset. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank Rahul for giving an legal application for our problems with Adani in Australia. Second, don't you think you can also apply your concept of intergenerational equity? Sounds very familiar to usufruct, the concept of usufruct, USUFRUCT, as mentioned by Thomas Jefferson at one time.
Yep.
And the third is, your plan sounds quite familiar. Have you ever studied Botswana by any chance? Because they managed to rise up from being the second poorest country in the world in 1965 when they achieved independence to being the second wealthiest country in Africa, overtaking South Africa. Thank you.
Yeah. The gentleman here, last question.
It's a very small question, but I was eager to ask it. It's to Rahul. You had this, you mentioned on this balancing thing of allowing the mining to happen and letting future generations and the state profit. You mentioned that there was a right to profit on the side of the miners, and you made this this form of a 100 cake, and you said the appropriate profit was 10. And I really wondered how you arrived at that 10. Why the appropriate profit is 10, not 1, not 99. I guess the miners probably wish it was 99, some people wish it was 1, and I wondered if you had some kind of justification for that, which appears to be the nut of the problem.
So we'll take these 7 questions, and I request authors to, the speakers to be brief, because we have about 5 minutes to.
The question about the gender and social equity in the direct income support measures. Across the state, we found, since it is given only based on land ownership, it followed the same pattern of ownership. Incidentally, in Telangana, for last 10 years or so, there is a law which says women equally inherit land. Not implemented properly, but at least many got that one. But for that, there's no, very clearly, many Dalits were left out and women were left out, and single women were there, they were also left out. So in all this. So it didn't follow any of these principles. Another question was about the current income status. Unfortunately, in India, there is no way income is measured in this country. There is only one survey which is done, National Sample Survey, and everything else is based on using that data and then making their own calculations. There's no income measure in this country. But the data based on the growth rate in agriculture shows that the growth rate is only about 3%. The expected growth rate was about 10% per year, but it's only about 3%. So it has not doubled. Probably it has reached about 20% higher in 5 years' time. Not more than that. The agriculture prices have gone down significantly. It has gone down by about 30% in the last 5 years.
Yeah, lots of questions to me. Let me go from the easy to the most difficult. There was a question on why was a profit of 10 for the mining companies. And it's not 10 on 100, it's actually the sale price was 170. And the way in the financial world, and you can look at power sector utility pricing, they say that you get your full cost plus to the extent you've deployed capital in the business. You've created the power plant, there's working capital. The financial markets demand a return on that capital. And that is an understood thing. Now, when you go into the annual report of CESA Goa in this particular case, the thought is if we ask them to be a contractor, how would they bid? So they would ask for all the expenses, and then there's a certain capital amount to be deployed on which they need to get a return. So that return we calculated at 20%. The amount of capital was already in the annual report. So we used that, and it turns out to be 10 in this particular case. In deep offshore oil, it may be 50. It depends on case to case, but in this particular case, it's 10. But we can discuss it. I mean, we don't have time for a cross question on this, yeah? Coming to the, I just want to also deal with this question of why dividend, or I should say I'm not going to deal with it, but I'm not sure exactly what the disconnect is. We're basically saying this is a property right. We all own the mineral. It's like a cooperative or a mutual fund. I mean, you can have a distorted distribution, but the logical one is a property right. We all own it. We should equally, so we should just get the benefit equally. But let's have this conversation separately because I'm not sure exactly where you see the disconnect. Okay? But I'm here again in 2 days, so we can have the question again. On Alaska, Adani, Botswana, and USA, Botswana, I looked at all these examples, Alaska, Norway, Botswana, and many other places. Even a place like Norway actually has signs of the resource curse because they don't have all of these principles in place. They don't insist on zero loss, nor are they distributing a dividend. And the same thing with Botswana. Botswana is headed towards a resource curse issue. You just don't see it just now. But when you look at it a little bit longer, you're going to see that when the diamonds run out, there is going to be a problem. And one part of the problem is that many of you have talked about what we get from mining as revenue. It's not revenue because when you sell your asset, what you get is not revenue. And this is a framing issue which I'm going to discuss a little bit more a couple of days from now. But coming back to Alaska and the budget crisis they're having now, it's basically because only actually 18.3% of the money they get from the oil is going into the permanent fund. And the rest of the money is creating the budget volatility. And the correct approach would have been to put 100% into the fund and then there's no budget volatility. And when the mineral is exhausted, because they're not using any of the money from the mineral, any case they're getting zero from it today. And then when the minerals is exhausted, they would still be just getting the income from the fund instead of, zero from the mineral. It's a slightly subtle point again, but if we can have a longer discussion or we can wait for a couple of days to have a further discussion on this, but I know we've run out of time today. So apologize for not being able to go further.
Just as a closing remarks, I'll just say that the two presentations on the farmer income transfers, it proves that there is a substantial amount of money available with the Indian state. And to my knowledge, I think Indian states are spending about 16% of their state domestic product on these transfers. So there is no dearth of money, and a resource constraint is perhaps, it's a question of whether political will, whether they would like to shift to the basic income. That will be a bigger question. And the other takeaway perhaps is that you have mining income, or you have got some resources like hydropower income, which can be tapped if there is a political will. And we stop at that, and the difficult question of political will, we will not take it up now. and I think we have closed the session, and I give it up to Sharath too.
Thank you very much. I think that was really, really very stimulating panel. And I think when ideas that have not yet been tested collide with the practices, different kinds of practices and habitual practices of our welfare system. And the question is that when new kinds of things happen, how do we read them? Do we read them and feel that something good is going to come out of it? Or do we read them as that it's same old thing in a new form? I think in India we have a long history of rehashing schemes again and again. So we are only hoping that in the future we will be able to influence the politicians to think of in a more innovative way so that we try to cut the leakages, try to think of actually addressing the whole question of the last man. That is what our concern is. Thank you very much, all the panelists. It was an extraordinary discussion. And we close for today.